Have you fallen into an open manhole recently? Do you find yourself in the company of strangers? Well, then you might very well be in the feature underground. The rumors are true. My name is Hunter Lanier, and I am here today with the inaugural episode of Feature Pantheon. This is a brand new video series in which I will be reviewing the movies that I think are the greatest ever made. Needless to say, my choices will be entirely subjective. I am not choosing movies out of their cultural significance or the movies that others have collectively agreed are the greatest ever made. These are my favorite movies. For the first episode, I have chosen Akira Kurosawa's 1963 character thriller, High and Low. If you're wondering why I chose High and Low as the very first movie, well, you're probably not thinking hard enough. There is a remake coming out this year, 2025, directed by Spike Lee and starring Denzel Washington. So, in the spirit of good timing, here we are. I do also want to stress that this review will have spoilers, as will all of the reviews that are part of Feature Pantheon. These movies have been out for quite some time, so if you haven't seen them, I encourage you to do so and then come back here and be part of the discussion. Of course, if you don't care about spoilers, that's cool too. Akira Kurosawa has a reputation for being one of the greatest directors of all time. In fact, his last name, I think, is synonymous with master. This is a reputation that I think is well deserved. Yes, Kurosawa may be considered by some to be film buff first grade, like Kubrick and Fellini and Scorsese. But just because every hipster with a quirky hot dog tattoo lists The Seven Samurai as one of their favorite movies, don't hold that against Kurosawa. A front to back watch of his cinematic omnibus will contain highs and lows, one might say, but the highs far exceed the lows. Although there are 5 Kurosawa movies that I would consider for Feature Pantheon, I do believe that High and Low is the greatest film from one of our greatest directors. I do also want to say that the film is based on a book called King's Ransom by Evan Hunter, and the screenplay is written by Kurosawa along with his frequent collaborators, whose names I will probably screw up: Hideo Oguni, Ryuzu Kikushima, and Eijiro Hiseta. Hopefully I said those approximately correct. High and Low stars Kurosawa's golden boy, Toshirō Mifune, one of cinema's very best leading men. And High and Low leverages Mifune's simmering masculinity to play the part of Kingo Gondo, a wealthy executive in the shoe industry who worked his way from the warehouse to the penthouse. And this drastic change of circumstances, of lifestyle, informs much of Kingo's character. Although he's rich, he's not a snobbish aristocrat, raised on house money and an Ivy League education. He is a capitalist success story that climbed the ranks, presumably through discipline, hard work, and maybe even cutting a few proverbial throats. Unlike the trust fund kid archetype, Kingo knows what it's like not to have money, which makes his grasp of it all the harder to loosen. As a matter of fact, when we first meet him, when we are introduced to the character, we find him in the throes of a heated business meeting, the latest in a drama of ruthless corporate Machiavellianism that we only really catch a glimpse of. You know it's an important meeting because it's not happening in a boardroom, it's happening in Kingo's living room during after hours. A few men from the company want Kingo's help in taking over, but Kingo relents. We later find out that Kingo already has his own plan to take over the company himself, for which he has borrowed money and mortgaged off all of his possessions. It's a high-stakes gambit he has likely planned for years. And it just so happens that right at this time, right at his most financially flimsy, he gets a call. A call that his son has been kidnapped. So what do we have here? A rich man must choose between his son and his wealth. Not the most interesting or original setup. But then the film takes a left turn when you find out that the kidnapper grabbed the wrong child. He grabs Kingo's son's friend, Shinji, whose father is hardly able to pay the ransom amount. Still, the kidnapper wants his money, and Kingo is the only one who is able to pay it. So what began as a painful no-brainer of an exchange all of a sudden becomes a little more questionable to Kingo. How much is he willing to give up for someone else's child? By paying the ransom, he's not only losing his money and all of his possessions, he is losing his identity as an important man, an identity you get the sense that he has scratched and clawed for. What's more, this is probably the first time in a long time that Kingo has felt powerless. And the resentment from that is probably fogging up his morals. This morality play is what takes up the entirety of the film's first hour, which takes place entirely in Kingo's living room. You don't leave the room, and you don't want to. It's such a riveting hour that you forget there's a world outside of the room. The calls coming from the kidnapper seem like they could be coming from a different dimension. Most obviously, this is a result of the screenplay. The fast-paced way in which you're introduced to Kingo, you quickly get a sense of his character, of how he has a vice grip on his own life. Then you see all of that control stripped away. Then the shock of the kidnapper grabbing the wrong child. And just as you start to process the repercussions of this mistake, so do the characters right along with you in real time. It's a beautiful introduction that both takes its time, slowly introducing things, like showing you the two kids playing cowboys and then going outside and disappearing. Yet it never lingers too long without giving you something new to consider. Of all the great dialogue during this opening hour, I think the winner belongs to Kingo's ambitious assistant, who's probably not too different from a young Kingo, and whose own future fortunes are tied into Kingo's. The assistant at one point says to Kingo, "You don't have the guts to let him die." Keep in mind, we are talking about a child. The other important part of this opening scene, opening hour, is how it's blocked out in this dark, confined space. And by the way, this dark, confined space is a perfect physical proxy for how the characters are feeling, trapped in this suddenly dark and evil world. As Kingo, his assistant, his family, the boy's distraught father, and the police all inhabit this living room together, Kurosawa creates these visually odd and therefore arresting images by how he arranges the characters on screen. I say visually odd because you often find that the character who is talking may be in the background while less relevant characters at the moment are in the foreground. Or the character speaking might be to the back and to the left while the characters in the foreground are over here, blocking your view. The camera is constantly forcing you to search the frame for the subject of interest, which just naturally keeps you engaged. Before I move on from the opening hour, this is also where you understand what the title is alluding to. When the kidnapper reveals that Kingo is living on a hill, and that the kidnapper is calling from down below. Kingo high, kidnapper below. It is an unsubtle but expeditious allegory for this battle between classes that permeates the rest of the movie. Later in the movie, when the police are searching for the kidnapper, you actually do see Kingo's house from down below, and you come to understand how it might be considered a contemptuous eyesore. Following the fantastic opening hour, we get this really great train scene in which Kingo exchanges the money for the child. This scene is extremely tense, filled with uncertainty, and almost a kind of motion sickness from the wobbling of the train and the screeching of the rails, all of which exacerbates the feeling that something could go horribly wrong. And yet, everything goes according to plan, which in some ways is the greatest shock. And this short sequence ends up being something of a bridge that leads to the next verse. And in that next verse, Kingo takes a backseat and we start following the police as they methodically piece together clues to find the kidnapper. The film essentially settles into being a police procedural at this point. Now, what's funny about this is that following the opening hour, which is entirely about Kingo's dilemma of weighing a human life against his wealth, the majority of the film actually ends up being about saving Kingo's money. It's a funny little self-subversion that I didn't notice before. Also, when thinking about the movies that I would do for Feature Pantheon and thinking about how much I love High and Low, I had totally forgotten that most of the movie is a police procedural. Now, normally I am not a fan of procedural dramas, as they typically become basically just a connect the dots. And that form of storytelling I just think is simple and mostly uninteresting. But Kurosawa does actually do a few interesting things. Firstly, he shows you the kidnapper early on, which makes the procedural more of a suspenseful race against time than a mystery. Kind of like Hitchcock's showing the audience the bomb before it goes off theory of suspense. And when you meet the kidnapper and you see his reaction when he finds out Kingo has become something of a local hero after spending all of his money on saving someone else's child, you understand the kidnapper's motives. In fact, this shift of public opinion toward Kingo, whom many people may have had similar feelings toward as the kidnapper, becomes integral to the story. I'd go so far as to say that this entire procedural drama is less of a whodunit and more of a what's it done. Another interesting twist that Kurosawa puts on the traditional procedural drama is that you have two investigations going on simultaneously. You have the police, and then you have Shinji and his father. The father is consumed by guilt for Kingo spending all of his fortune on his son. So he's forcing his son to mine his memories for any clues that will lead to the kidnapper. And in a fun way, these two parallel investigations end up ultimately converging at the same exact time, at the same exact place. Lastly, Kurosawa puts this summer filter on the entire movie. People are constantly wiping their foreheads, fans are on indoors, and it even works its way into the plot with the kidnapper being hot in the phone booth. And the heat also later feeds into his resentment toward Kingo and his poverty. This summer filter isn't super important, but it does add some extra texture to the movie. I also want to mention a very small moment when the police finally find the location of the junkies, which they know from earlier clues that it has a view of Mount Fuji. As they follow Shinji to the location of the junkies, the camera lingers just for a moment on Mount Fuji in the distance before continuing to follow the police. Little moments like this, I think, are part of why Kurosawa is such a great director, indulging in every little moment of inspiration, no matter how small. Just as in the opening hour, when the film subverts itself by having the kidnapper take the wrong child, the police procedural also ends up subverting itself at the very end, when they discover the kidnapper but don't arrest him. Instead, the police decide to frame him for a murder they think he's already committed. Now, I don't know what the laws were like in the 60s in Japan, but this seems highly illegal to me. In fact, a woman actually ends up dying during this whole entrapment scheme, and the movie moves right past it. Yeah, she was just a junkie and probably not contributing much to society, but as Bob Dylan once sang, he was only a hobo, but one more is gone, leaving no body to sing his sad song. Like the Mount Fuji moment, there is another small moment in this entrapment part of the movie. During the sequence when the undercover cop gives the kidnapper a fake note, one cop lights a cigarette as the kidnapper walks by, and the other cop jolts to attention. Again, this is a small thing, but the movie doesn't have a scene where the cops lay out their entrapment plan. You just see the lighting of the cigarette, and then you see the other cop react to it. It's just a small example of all the fat that makes police procedurals boring being trimmed away. Then we get to one of High and Low's most memorable sequences. The kidnapper moving throughout town as the police follow him from afar, waiting for him to fall into their trap. The reason it's memorable, partly, is that once again, the movie becomes something different. Just as the morality play is nothing like the police procedural is nothing like this sequence. It suddenly becomes this very sexy 60s cat and mouse game in which the kidnapper strolls through town through these hip young crowds of expats in these big reflective sunglasses, which is probably one of the most famous pairs of sunglasses in movie history. The sunglasses give the kidnapper, otherwise a pretty normal looking young guy, this otherworldly look, dehumanizing him by taking his eyes away from the audience. It's sort of become trite at this point to use mirrors in film to communicate a character having an identity crisis. But here we have a character who is wearing the mirrors, reflecting the world back at the world. And I think that tells you that the kidnapper is a reactionary being, someone who defines himself not by his own choices, but by the choices of others, of society, of Kingo. He has allowed himself, and maybe even embraced, becoming a walking consequence rather than an individual. Even after the kidnapper is caught by the police finally, the film once again subverts your expectations by having it all happen too late. They get Kingo's money back, but all of his possessions have already been confiscated. The scene in which we find out ends with the chiming of a grandfather clock that has a confiscation notice on it. Time is up, and on a clock that doesn't even belong to him anymore. And now for the final scene. As I said before, when I was thinking about how much I loved High and Low, it was this final scene that I kept thinking about. Naturally, it is the movie's final impression, so maybe it's not too surprising that it's what stuck with me. Separated by glass, Kingo has a face-to-face with the kidnapper who is now on death row. We find out that Kingo has restarted his life at a smaller shoe company, where he may even end up being more happy than he was before, as he has more freedom. The kidnapper goes into all his reasons for kidnapping the child, and none of them surprise us by this point. It was a surprise attack in a war of classes that Kingo probably didn't even know he was in. Watching the movie again, however, I was struck by something else. I was struck by the difference in their faces. On one side, you have the kidnapper, who's a young man with baby fat in his cheeks. And on the other side, in the red corner, you have Toshirō Mifune, who has one of the most macho, stoic, lived-in faces in film history. Right up there with Clint Eastwood and Steve McQueen and Humphrey Bogart. And this gives that scene, I think, a little tinge of generational warfare as well, especially once the young man becomes emotional and Kingo remains stoic. There's that difference between the let it all out generation of the 60s and the bury it as deep as you can generation of World War II. And since this is the first time, I think, in the movie that you hear the kidnapper actually speak, you do start to get the impression that, like many young criminals and terrorists inspired by politics, he seems quite intelligent, but ultimately insane as he starts to shake and yell. And in this moment, at the very end of the movie, we get the sense for the very first time that all of these machinations, all of this trauma, all of this pain happened not as the result of a chess move or a surprise attack, but from the chaotic actions of a lunatic. If he'd just been a little more clear-headed at the end, had a very clear manifesto, had a very clear point of view that he communicated, the film might have ended on the feeling that right won over wrong, an outcome that could be theoretically replicated. And with that, left you with a feeling of closure and satisfaction. Instead, the film leaves you and Kingo left staring at his own reflection in the glass, once again with the feeling of powerlessness. Welp, those are all my thoughts. Now is the time for you to let me know your thoughts on my thoughts. Remember, I don't want these videos to be one-way traffic. I don't want to just be here telling you my opinion. I want my opinion to be a conversation starter. So get down in the comments and start talking about the movie. I'm sure, like many of you who have also seen the movie and love it like I do, I'm sure you also have a lot of reservations about highest to lowest. As much as I love Denzel Washington, and I think Spike Lee has made some good movies, not quite to the degree of Kurosawa. Um, Judging by the title, it seems like the movie is going to be different and not just a step by step remake. I do question this need to remake great movies. I wish people would remake movies that aren't so good. I would rather see Spike Lee remake, what was the one, Don't Tread on the Tiger's Tail? I don't remember liking that one very much. Or Stray Dog, I'm not a huge fan of. Don't remake Vertigo, remake Jamaica Inn. As for what is next on Feature Pantheon, I will leave that as a surprise, partly as a result of me not knowing what it is myself. But I will choose, and there will be more coming. But I will have a regular review of a new release up on the 14th. I will be reviewing the new Mission Impossible movie. So look forward to that. Until then, I leave you with the gentle reminder that every day underground is a good day.